I encourage everyone to look up the painting by the famous French artist Henri Matisse. It's called The Dancers. And for me, this has always been a profound visualization of the intimate dance, the erotic dance that God desires with us. There's a fluidity, and the dancers retain their individual uniqueness, but they operate as one movement. And that for me is really what divine Eros is that intimate movement of God towards us and our response to that.
Okay, welcome everyone to the Orthodox Christian podcast. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Father Symeon Price. And for everyone listening or watching, Father Symeon, why don't you take a second to introduce yourself and tell everyone what you spend your time doing?
Well, as you heard, my name is Father Symeon Price. I am the husband of one wife, the father of 4 children, the caretaker of 2 rabbits, and the servant of 2 cats. As far as what I spend my time doing, I receive a paycheck from the Ministry of Children and Families, which is the Child and Family Development Protection for the province of British Columbia, and I work specifically with First Nations communities, ensuring that their culture, tradition, and ceremonies remain an integral part of the planning for kids in care, and also working in reconciliation with communities and bringing kids and families back home. I also have my own private therapeutic practice. I sit as the Orthodox representative on the Interfaith Chaplaincy Board for Correction Services Canada. I'm ensuring that all inmates have free access to their chosen faith traditions. I'm the treasurer of St. Silas Orthodox Prison Ministry. I am the rector at St. Nicholas Orthodox Mission in Kamloops and the second priest at St. Herman's of Alaska in Langley. So many hats and not much of my own time. It is always someone else's time.
Right. Yeah, I imagine that would be the case given that long list of vocations that you're taking up.
No. Let's be careful. I have one vocation and several occupations. So I am always a priest, and I have occupations like social worker and chaplain. I make that differentiation between vocation and occupation to preserve my sanity for the most part.
Right. Yes. So tell us a little bit about your religious background, what you grew up with in terms of a faith tradition, and then how you wound up in the Orthodox Church, or at least how you first encountered the Orthodox Church.
I started my life in a traditional Mennonite Brethren environment, not general conference. If you know the difference, you know the difference. My mom came from a long line of Mennonites. When my dad came from a Orthodox English and Cherokee tradition. So when he married my mom, he sort of became Mennonite. So I was raised in a very conservative, traditional, evangelical home. And if I'm honest, I don't know if I ever particularly participated fully in the process. I was baptized in the MB Church when I was 16. For me, it was a bit of a. I did it because it was required of me and because it gave me the chance to pick up girls at youth group. To be blunt, I, for the most part, abandoned that belief structure at about 17 and had no interest in it. I still attended and still went to things again because it was the place to pick up girls, and it was easy. But I had no vested interest and no particular attachment to the type of religion that was being professed there. So I went on my way and I explored all sorts of stuff from, Rastafarianism to really staunch secular atheism, all sorts of different things. And slowly, after struggling with some really significant mental health issues, began to find comfort with the notion that God was a present being, beyond the sort of mechanistic approach that I had, grown up with, where it's sort of that idea of God as the watchmaker. And it seemed to me that given my somehow miraculous survival during those years, that God as a being must be aware of me and engaged in some way with my existence in order, because there's no other way to explain some of the things that I survived. Some by my own hand and some by accident. And then I began to, like I said, I began to be okay with that reality, and to try and discover what that meant for me. And then I met my dear wife, surprisingly, at a family gathering. Her cousin was a very good friend of mine. And that was really sort of the return of myself to a relationship with God and eventually with Christ. I would go so far as to say that I wasn't really a Christian in the proper sense of the word. I didn't have a relationship with Christ until I was in my late 20s after I met my wife. And then we went to, she was already attending Columbia Bible College in Abbotsford, home of a good many now Orthodox people. And so I joined her there. And it was during that period there when, I took my first sort of church history class, and I had taken a bunch of other university classes of philosophy, anthropology, and history. So I was aware of the broadness of Christian history. And so it wasn't a big shock to me that there was to learn Byzantine and church history and its connection with the present. What really changed things for me was I was given an assignment in that class. It was in my second year to do a biography of someone from church history. And I really had no idea what I wanted to do, other than the fact that I didn't want to do anyone past the Protestant Reformation. I didn't find a lot of meat there theologically, and so I was looking for something more, and I was sort of just wandering around the library looking for something to work on. And I all I can say is that Saint Symeon was present there guiding me, because I stumbled on the life of Saint Symeon, the theologian, his works, his poetry, and I was overwhelmed with the beauty and with the language of intimacy expressed in his words and in his poetry in particular. And I had always written poetry, and it was part of my healing journey, so it really resonated with me, and that sort of built this desire to know more, not necessarily factually and understand, the progression of doctrine and the shifting tides of church history, but to really be invested in the relationship with what I would come to know as the church fathers. And so that was the very beginning of that relationship. And as I look back on it, there's an understanding that when we're baptized and we are given a name of a saint or someone that, to use at the chalice, it's often understood that those saints were aware of us long before we were even aware. And that relationship really, for me, is very profound and meaningful, hence the name St. Symeon. And still to this day, I have this deep, abiding, personal, mysterious relationship with my beloved hero in the faith, really. And that initial sort of mystical encounter pushed me into doing a directed study where the text I chose was the Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church by Vladimir Lossky, because why not start at the top? That and St. Maximus. And that sort of propelled me into really being invested in the theoria of the Orthodox faith, the way of being Orthodox. I was still practicing in an evangelical way, but there was a deepening spiritual union that was going on, and one that was the best word to describe is one that was very erotic in the proper sense of the word, because I was being wooed by God, and I found that that relationship fascinating. Now, it took a long time because I'm stubborn as a mule sometimes. So after graduating from Columbia Bible College, I got a position as a pastor at a Pentecostal church plant, which I found quite interesting because I was pretty much in opposition to most of what it meant to be a Pentecostal. So there's a very interesting dynamic there. And I think oftentimes for us as converts, we can look back on our former days with a little bit of, oh, if only I had known, or why didn't they tell me? And so there's a little bit of we have a little bit of an adversarial position sometimes, get a little bit angry. And, I certainly went through that. But looking back, those were really necessary parts in order for me to understand the relationship between Orthodox spiritual life and practice. So when I became a pastor, I started instituting weekly communion at our Pentecostal church, right? And then I had icons on the communion table, and I'm pushing the boundaries of praxis within this very sort of non-traditional evangelical church. We were meeting in a movie theater, and yet it's in that place where my understanding of the necessity between sort of what we would call spirituality and religion began to grow. And it got to the point where I couldn't there was no way for my spirituality to continue to grow unless it was directly connected to my practice, which eventually led to my resignation. And my wife and I and our 4 kids were received into the Orthodox Church through baptism on September 16th, 2012.
Okay, so 11 years ago.
Yes.
Okay,
a lifetime ago.
Yeah. So
like.
let me try and summarize some of that. So you raised maybe perhaps in a slightly nominal setting within the Mennonite Brethren Church, or at least you didn't adhere to the faith closely, and It was just it was a means to an end. It was a great way to meet women, essentially. And then after that, you had a period where you tried out different things. You weren't necessarily satisfied with them. You had some interesting experiences, so maybe we can return to that if you'd like to talk about that. And then at that point, something turned in your heart and you were directed more towards the God of Christianity, and we're headed in that direction. You met your wife, or soon-to-be wife, I suppose, at a family gathering. She was going to Columbia Bible College. Okay, so then another question is, what happened there? Because I assume it's not just because she was going there that you decided to go. It seems like there's some sort of transformation that occurs there as well. So if you could tell just that first part, what are these experiences that sort of shot you towards God, as well as what was it that inspired you to get further education in theology?
Sure. So I was diagnosed with rapid cycling bipolar disorder when I was 21, which included auditory and visual hallucinations. And even though I was diagnosed at 21, I was experiencing those difficulties from an early age. They just didn't do that sort of stuff in the 80s, right? So when I was 21, I was very much trapped in mental illness and saw death, my own death, as the greatest therapeutic act that I could do to heal both myself and those around me. And so I made several attempts to take my own life, and one specifically where this is before cell phones, obviously. Um, I was at my parents' house and I had taken all the phones off the hook, and I proceeded to take all of my medication and a lot of alcohol and some other stuff, and prepared myself to die. And somehow, my aunt, who lived in Alberta at the time, got up and called 911 because she had received a phone call from our house. Well, that was not possible. So all of a sudden, the ambulance was there. I was taken to ICU, and there was no way that I should have survived. Like, they didn't understand. They didn't understand how I was actually still conscious and alive at the same time. And so I was obviously, because of that, I was placed in the psych unit, and it was there that I encountered and I know it's hard for some people because, wow, didn't you just say you had auditory, and visual hallucinations? That's true. But I encountered Christ in that moment, in that place. And in order to reach me, the Lord quoted a line from Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin. There are two paths to go by, but there's still time to choose the road you're on. And presented me with the opportunity of choice, that choice was always going to be there, that the choice for life was never going to be taken away from me, but I needed to participate in it if it was going to be a reality. And that for me was the beginning of that journey towards a personal connection with God. And as far as like a desire to do theological studies, I had never not been a reader. I had taken 2 years of a philosophy degree at what was then the College of the Fraser Valley. And so I was always interested in trying to explain and understand reality and how reality was constructed and how people navigated both the known and the unknown. So when I actually got fired from my job before 2 months before I was going to ask my wife Christa to marry me, and so I had nothing. I had lost my job, a lot of it due many reasons, and I had nothing to do. And my wife, well, soon to be wife, my fiance at that time, was like, "You're going to go to school with me. You're going to go to school." And I was like, "Okay, sounds good." And I just enrolled and started. I didn't have any plans on being a quote unquote pastor. In fact, that's why I enrolled in the youth work program, because I was interested in being a youth counselor. Because of my own experiences with mental health and the challenges of substance abuse and all this sort of stuff, I had a real vested personal interest in that. So I didn't really have any desire to be a quote unquote pastor or even like a youth pastor or anything like that. And it was obviously in that second year where I think God began to impress upon my heart that I needed, there was almost a calling into leadership, and to be able to express and be a person who had lived through all of this stuff, but was also able, to stand at the front and do what needed to be done there. And my mind works in such a way that it thinks, quote unquote, theologically all the time. So I wasn't studying something that wasn't already going on in my mind, that I wasn't already thinking about. So it was a very natural progression for me. Um, and yeah, it just, it sort of, it was a very organic experience. Um, Not an easy organic experience, but one that certainly wasn't necessarily prepared by me. It was more about my participation in this process that was ongoing, and that if I chose not to participate, which there was always the freedom to do that. There was always freedom to choose the road that I was on. If I was going to choose not to participate, then I wasn't going to be fully human. I was never going to be able to function in reality the way I needed and was created to function. So for me, it really was more than just sort of, I guess, religious experience. It was a very human experience, and a very much a unifying process of body, of soul and body. And that for me was that's what theology is for me. Is not necessarily the study of, but the living in a theological world. And yeah, I think that answers those two questions.
Yeah. That's good. And it reminds me of knowing God in the sense of the dual meaning, where you've got the mental knowing, but also the
Mm-hmm.
practical, physical knowing, in the same sense that Adam knew
Mm-hmm.
his wife and she
Mm-hmm.
conceived. So there's that full spectrum. It
Yeah.
includes the whole person. So, but with that, I'm curious about divine eros, or you
Mm-hmm.
use the term
Yeah.
erotic, which is a strange term in some theological circles. There's actually a long history in Orthodoxy. So
Yeah.
maybe just explain what you mean by that in relation to God.
Well, as far as Eros in that context, divine Eros is the desire of God to be intimate with creation, with me as a human being. Uh, it is through the Trinity, and it's not simply about, a conversion of mind, but it really is an invitation to dance. And the way best to describe it obviously is visually. And I encourage everyone to look up the painting by the famous French artist Henri Matisse. It's called The Dancers. And for me, this has always been a profound visualization of the intimate dance, the erotic dance that God desires with us. There's a fluidity, and the dancers retain their individual uniqueness, but they operate as one movement. And that for me is really what divine Eros is that intimate movement of God towards us and our response to that. And in the same way, like this is the nature of the Song of Solomon. This is the nature of the imagery of the bridegroom, that these it's the best way to describe it. These erotic moments are really what we experience of God's love. I think as human beings, we like to use the word God's unconditional love and God agape. I don't. Agape remains unknowable for us because we're always conditioned. And so I think what we experience as God's love is actually Eros. And it's a very personal, intimate encounter. And you find this even in ascetic writing, especially, and in Orthodox monasticism, the idea of celibacy isn't a denial of that desire for intimacy, but rather a gift that one receives from God to meet that. In the same way marriage meets our desire for erotic, intimate love, they are examples, they are types of the archetypal Eros that we encounter in our union with Christ.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And that imagery of a husband and a wife coming together and being united in making love, in the sense
Yeah.
that they are united physically and yet they're distinct. And also the notion, and I think St. Gregory of Nyssa talks about this, that there is both satisfaction and desire for something greater. And that's what we experience in relation to God, because God is infinite and we are finite. And so we are satisfied with God, and yet we long to experience more of God, because he is the source
Yeah.
of all goodness and truth and beauty.
And this is the mystery of divine Eros, right? Because it's desire and satisfaction in the same thing. And the thing about if it's simply human desire will drive you to insanity and drive you to death. Because as soon as that desire is satisfied, that it disappears, and you're always yearning for more. Desire never satisfies. We can never satisfy our desire. The desire to know what we are is never going to be satisfied in another human being, in another activity, because it's incapable of doing that. And yet in God, in Trinitarian form, we are satisfied and our desire is increased, and our we're satisfied continue. It's one of those things where you just simply have to experience the mystery and understand that process of Eros, of divine Eros, continues for eternity. And for someone like me who really struggled with seeing any value in my existence as a human being, who has stood at the door, at the abyss, so to speak, and jumped in, because for me at those points death was the best option available. To know that the creator, the very central principle of reality, desires to be intimate with me for my own well-being, not to satisfy some strange fetish that God has, but for my own well-being, for my own salvation, to become fully human. That for me has given me insight into the suffering of my life, and why I have had to suffer the things that I have had to suffer. So there's that. For me, it's the foundation of my hope.
Okay. So I would love to keep on talking in that route, but I do want to also hear about how you eventually encountered the Orthodox Church. So you initially come to these readings of St. Symeon, the New Theologian, in the library of Columbia Bible College. You think, what is this? This is amazing. And you read these and then have a directed study. But eventually, I mean, you do wind up in a Pentecostal church as a pastor.
Yeah.
And so did you visit an Orthodox church at that point, or was it still much more of an engagement through books?
My first encounter with an Orthodox community was the Monastery of All Saints in Eros, because that was the only thing I knew about, and that was just, I had went there to do an interview with some of the people there, and that was essentially it. So for me, all of the learning was still based on what I was reading, until some of my friends from Bible college began to convert to Orthodoxy. My colleague now, Father Ryan Bishop, we'll say a priest in now Edmonton. We graduated in the same year. Mike Leroy, who sings in the choir and is at St. Herman's. I began to hear of all these, and so I went to a house blessing for now Father Ryan and Mike, and Father Lawrence Farley was there. And that was our first interaction, which began a sort of 6-month relationship where I would meet him once a week and essentially do catechesis because I couldn't come on Sundays because I was at work. I couldn't just I'm not coming to church today. I'm going to go to this other church, right? It didn't work like that. So my catechesis was very different because I was already in full-time ministry. And so it looked a little different. And so my first entry into actually learning and seeing Orthodoxy alive was through this personal relationship I had with my spiritual father, Father Lawrence. And I think that really that needed to happen in order for me to gain the courage and the strength to leave my job. Now, for me, it was I couldn't continue to lead with integrity and honesty and truthfulness and continue to move towards orthodoxy. And so, I was encouraged, if not exhorted, by Father Lawrence to make a decision. And with the reality being that if I chose to stay within that Pentecostal world, that my spiritual life would die. There would be nothing. So after many prayerful nights with my wife, I decided to resign, which meant I went from a paycheck to no paycheck all of a sudden. And that was very, very difficult but at that point, both me and my wife had decided that and come to the understanding that the truth, the person of Christ, was worth way more than a salary. And that God, having already shown his provision in very manifest physical ways, saving my life, would certainly provide for us in our search and our next step into the truth. And so in September of 2011, I resigned, and we became catechumens the first Sunday we were all there. So you could imagine, we showed up and we made catechumen, and most people didn't even know who we were because they hadn't seen us, right? So it was a very unique situation, and very humbling, right? To go from the pastor of a flourishing church. We were in the 250 to 300 range, and we were growing and growing, and lots of amazing things and wonderful things going on. And then to be nothing more than a catechumen. And not only did that happen, but, and this will maybe go to the next question about challenges, is I suffered a severe physical injury that essentially disabled me from March of 2011 to end of 2017. So not only did our conversion to Orthodoxy come along with me leaving my job and my paycheck and my benefits and all this sort of stuff, it came with also the inability of me to do anything physically or to work, which means we had to leave our home and move in with my wife's in-laws into their basement. So it was and that's why I use the word convert and not join, because for us, it really was a conversion of everything that we had known up to that point, being left behind and something entirely new happening.
So, if you could summarize what the reasons were that you chose to join the Orthodox Church, you've hinted at several of them,
Hmm.
but if you had to list them out, what would be those reasons for yourself?
The first one is the truth. I left the evangelical world behind because the Orthodox Church is the truth being Christ. And there was, when faced with that, the decision was easy. And I know that maybe that sounds just a little bit too simple, but that's the reality. I wouldn't have had the courage to leave all of that behind, and my wife to leave all of that and go into this unknown place if I didn't know that this was the truth, that this was the fullness of the Christian faith. And that's the answer I give to people is why did you leave? I, doctrinal issues aside, practice, all that sort of stuff, when it boils down to it, it's in the Orthodox Church that the fullness of my humanity met with the fullness of Christ. And I I will go to my deathbed saying that that's worth giving up everything for. And when faced with that decision, it's a life or death decision. You either choose the death of your spiritual life, or you choose to live and grow in fullness. And I mean, after that, I mean, as a very visually and aesthetic oriented person, the beauty of the church, especially for my wife, who's a very artistic and visual person, the way in which truth is communicated really resonated with her and with me. The depth of the theological discourse, and we spent a lot of time listening to Father Thomas Hopko. And what struck me and at the beginning of listening to him was the way in which he dialogued. It wasn't argumentative. It was simply, this is the truth. You can choose to do with it what you will, but he didn't have the need to win anyone over. It wasn't argumentative. It wasn't dialectical. It wasn't like, I'm going to beat you with my profound apologetics and logical reasoning. It's simply, this is the truth. Take it or leave it. But I'm not here to argue about it. And that was really refreshing for me, because coming from, being trained to some degree in philosophical and logical dialectics and discourse, and then of course in apologetics, I was prone to become what I'll call an intellectual bully, which is to use my intellectual capacity to defeat other people's concepts about God and to argue about it. And I remember my wife saying soon after we converted, and this is the sort of my guiding light, is that if I wanted people to know that the Orthodox Church was the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the fullness of Christianity revealed, then I had to be more like Christ each and every day. That was the only argument I was allowed to have. And if I didn't have that argument, then I didn't have anything to stand on. And, certainly there are times when I've failed miserably at that. But I'm thoroughly convinced that Christ spoke directly through her to me to give me that, because it really did change the way that I communicated with people about my faith. And then honestly, being disabled and going through that process, I didn't have the energy to argue with people. I just I didn't have it. All I had was me just showing up at church and sitting in the corner and trying to stand.
Hmm. So you mentioned that truth was the main thing that propelled you into the Orthodox Church. Could you bring that concept down to a concrete level and specify how the Orthodox Church offered you the truth?
It was through relationship. It was through sort of this, I don't know, this is where just want to say, look, it's just a mystery. It's one
Were you wrestling with certain concepts or anything? Like sometimes people come in because they see the apostolic succession or they see the notion of God and Trinity and other things. None of that? Okay.
none of that. Everything that I had no, because again, I had sort of really emptied myself of any attachment to sort of Protestant approaches to faith. I just sort of emptied myself of that and hadn't really attached to anything. And so, and as someone who really prized the freedom of my mind, the length and breadth and uniqueness and diversity within the Orthodox tradition about thinking and knowing God, for me that was a clear evidence that this was the truth. That so much of the theological workings of the church fathers was about their own genuine personal encounters with the living God. And in fact, that's one of the great quotes from Saint Symeon, the new theologian, is that without a direct personal encounter with the living God, you have nothing, right? You can know all you can know about God as an intellectual pursuit, but without that direct personal encounter, that's not really going to happen. And that is what drew me. That is what has kept me, and that is what has sustained me. Is that I know for certain that in the Orthodox Church is where I am able to encounter the fullness of that intimate, direct personal encounter. So another one that St. Symeon, the new theologian, says, and I like this one, it's very concrete, that you must be as conscious with your relationship with Christ as you are aware of putting on pants in the morning. If you go out into the world without pants on, everybody's going to know. You're going to know. It's going to be really embarrassing, but everybody's going to see it. In the same way, your relationship with Christ, this deeply mysterious, raw thing, needs to be that conscious. It needs to be. You need to be that aware of it and that involved in it. And it was like going from being in the kiddie pool and thinking I was in the deep, deep ocean, and realizing I was in the kiddie pool, and then finding out what it's like to stand in front of the ocean and realize what I thought was a deep, abiding relationship with Christ was really shallow, not untrue, and not the capacity of salvation was never in doubt, right? It was just now here I was in the ocean. This is just, why would anybody want to be in a kiddie pool when the ocean's available?
Yes. Okay. So it's the depth of truth that you encountered within the Orthodox Church, and that was manifest in the relationship you had, or that was on offer, so to speak,
Yeah,
with God, with the
yeah,
saints, even with people that were currently alive,
yeah,
etc., in the sense of being around you. Okay. So that's helpful. And then you mentioned some of these challenges, or at least the large
yeah,
challenge initially
yeah.
was being disabled for a period of time. I mean, tell us a little bit about that, but also tell us if there were certain challenges that were maybe specific to the Orthodox Church, either at the time of conversion or thereafter, that you had to overcome.
Well, I will say this as a preface to the challenge of my physical challenges, is that on the day of my baptism, I couldn't actually get into the baptismal font by myself. I needed to be helped up and helped out. And I told them all, look, don't fill the font up too much because I'm not small. When I get in there, it's going to overflow everything. And they didn't listen. And sure enough, as the last one going in, there was a tidal wave of water everywhere. Everybody's feet got wet. And when I came out of that water, I knew in the very intimate sense of knowing that I was now part of the body of Christ. And these people were now my brothers and sisters. It stopped being a metaphor. It stopped being an analogy, and it became reality. And because my physical body didn't work, I needed to know that. I needed to know the physicality and the let's call it the muck and mire of Christ's existence in the church. This justice wasn't some, mystical, ethereal idea, but there was a real physicality to it. And to be honest, being in church was the only place I felt comfortable in my body. So what happened to me is I went into the hospital to get a cortisone shot for meniscus that I tore playing hockey, and the injection, for some reason, this never happens. Cortisone injection, it went septic, and I nearly lost my leg. And I was in the hospital for 3 weeks, and this was the we were catechumens, so this was my first. This happened over Pascha. So when I woke up from my first, they had to surgically irrigate it. When I woke up from my first surgery, now we had only been catechumens since September, maybe 6 months. The first person I saw outside of my wife was Father Lawrence. I got out of the hospital, and the choir from St. Herman came to my house and sang for me. And it was overwhelming to experience these people who I barely knew, who were now my brothers and sisters. So, for me, physically being unable to do anything, being unable to work, I became dependent. I became dependent on my wife. She had to do everything. And, as a man, to go from being the sole provider of income and all that sort of stuff, I felt completely inadequate and completely incapable as a man and a husband and a father. And I struggled to know where my place was in the Orthodox Church. I had come from being a pastor, and I knew that was my vocation. And I knew that the priesthood was there. I just didn't. I needed that suffering to make me understand what the priesthood meant. So that physical discomfort, which is still here, by the way, it hasn't, the Lord has chosen that I get to carry it around for a while. We'll see. And it put a lot of strain on my marriage relationship. It resulted in me getting something called complex regional pain syndrome, which has a divorce rate of 95% when one partner has it. And the only reason that we were able to stay together, that we were able to work through this, is because we were Orthodox. And people would say, well, if you had, what would have life been like if you just stayed at that church? You probably would have grown, everything would be great. I'm like, but I wouldn't know the truth. And yeah, it's been really, really hard. It's been a very difficult journey. But it has been so illuminating as to what it truly means to be human. Now, my in-laws, because we had to move in there, got to experience our growth in the church, and there was a lot of camaraderie. They may not understand, but they were so accommodating. They would accommodate us for fasting periods, and it was wonderful. My parents, on the other hand, wanted nothing to do with the Orthodox Church. despite the fact that my grandmother, my dad's mom, was baptized in the Orthodox Church, they were too far entrenched in that fundamentalist evangelical model. And still to this day, I think my dad's a little more comfortable with things, but my mom can barely stand being in a church, Orthodox church. And I had to go through the process of sort of forsaking them, which is really a cathartic experience, and realizing that my family, because I had been reborn in baptism, I had a new family. Actually, my biological parents were still my biological parents, but they were not the source. They were not the source of who I was and my identity. They were not my new family. My new family was my brothers and sisters in Christ in the Orthodox Church, past, present, and future. And to know that, to experience the reality that my children are in a faith community that is going to remain consistent. That in 1,000 years from now, Lord willing, my this connection that my family has made will continue in our family. And being immersed in that, and knowing that we have a relationship with all of those who have gone before us, and all of those who will come forward, because time is an interesting concept in Orthodoxy. It's like the best family gathering every Sunday. And for me, that is the concrete reality that keeps me coming back, and keeps me rooted in the church. Is that it's not just a place where doctrine is discussed, or whatever. It is my family. It is my home. It's where I was born. It's where I grew up. And I can never leave. Like, I go 1 week without liturgy and I'm feeling sketchy and disconnected and unrooted. 2 weeks and I'm a mess. It really is like become intertwined in, or if I can use a technical term, it's the nature of that perichoretic, that interpenetration that happens, where I can't see myself outside of the church. And that happens as one progresses, which is why Orthodoxy is a practice, right? Where you're continuing to practice. I mean, Christianity is a practice. It never reaches its full realization, not even in eternity. And for me, that's wonderful. I wouldn't want to be in something that said, well, once you've sort of figured these things out, these particular systems, and you've done all this, then you've got it figured out. Then you're good to go. All right. That for me, that's rationalism and not relational.
Mm-hmm.
And
mm-hmm.
all the challenges that we face, the being, I had to go on disability, and you don't make a lot of money on disability. And so it cost us a lot, and it cost my kids a lot. And, we are together and stronger because of the church, and because we chose to leave, because those things very well could have happened outside of that. And it is because we are in the church, and because we are continually nourished through the church and in Christ, that we're able to survive. I'm alive and a functioning human being, and a priest no less, because of that reality. And I have no argument for anyone about that. Simply come and see. In the same way that Christ called the disciples, come and see, and they, as we read in St. Mark's Gospel, did everything immediately. That's the only thing that I could offer. If you're looking for what the Orthodox Church is, it's experienced in the liturgy with people in the agape meal afterwards that will go beyond all of the theological reading you could do. You can read the Ambigua by St. Maximus and in Greek, and you can understand it, and yada, yada, yada. But until you're able to live in the community that gave birth to those minds and those lives, you will never really properly live the faith.
Right. Yeah, okay. So let me summarize again. So joining the Orthodox Church, it wasn't necessarily that the Orthodox Church presented a lot of problems to you in the sense of overcoming theological obstacles, largely because it sounds you were already walking that path in many respects before joining the Orthodox Church, because you incorporated many elements in the Pentecostal setting you were part of. It was more so that it just created a lot of pain in your life in the sense of going from a stable income to nothing, essentially, and then also having a skill set as a pastor that's hard to market outside of the pastoral world.
It is very much hard to do that.
And then added to that was this unfortunate event of being disabled, which you're already dealing with a lot of consequences because of the lack of finances. So there's that side. There's also the side of moving in with your in-laws, which is a very difficult thing to do as well. And then added to that was the other aspect of pain of being disabled. So you were really enveloped in a storm for a number of years, and that was a hard thing to go through. But it sounds like you were able to weather that storm. At least you attribute it largely to being part of the Orthodox Church.
Yeah, it reminds me of St. Peter getting out of the boat in the middle of a crazy storm and walking towards the Lord, and realizing how much danger he was in, and losing sight, and then reaching up to have the Lord save him and crying out, and the Lord saying to him, "O ye of little faith." And for me, that's not Christ wagging his finger at Peter, like, "Oh, what are you doing?" It's him encouraging Peter that little amount of faith that you had was enough to get you out of a boat in the middle of a storm and walk on water, Peter. That little bit. "O ye of that little bit, my hand is always there for you to pull you out when you're struggling, when your eyes and your life gets consumed by the chaos around you." And there's so much encouragement and hope for me personally in that, in the work that I do with suffering people, and all sorts of stuff within the indigenous communities, to see and know that just a small amount of faith is enough, and that I don't need to be St. Maximus. I don't need to be St. Gregory of Nyssa. I don't need to be St. Symeon the theologian. I just need a little bit, just enough to get me out the boat. And Christ is faithful to provide that. And that boat is like Father Lawrence said to me very early on, that the Orthodox Church is like Noah's Ark. It's full of animals who go to the bathroom and eat in the same spot. They stink, they smell, it's gross, it's disgusting. But it's the only place that you're saved from the storms of life. So as long as you're comfortable hanging out with other animals, the Orthodox Church is for you. Because it's really when the storms of life come and the chaos of life, and it's the only option to float. It's the only place to find true rest in the midst of that suffering. It's the only place where you get the courage to step out of the boat and into the world, so that you can be in the world but not of the world. And that's how I survive. I mean, my job is being in the world. It's being in the midst of a lot of pain and suffering and a lot of demonic activity, and it's rough. It's a rough job that I have. And I wouldn't be able to do that job and actually get through the day without knowing that all I need is a little bit of faith. All I need is a little bit. A little bit is enough. A little bit is enough, right? And that's really what the process of salvation is. Just those little moments of faith that give you enough. And when you fail, like we're all going to fail. When our eyes get, when we take our eyes off Christ and we get consumed by the challenges of life and living in this world, Christ doesn't, shake his finger at us and turn away. In fact, he reaches out and he takes hold of us and pulls us up so that we can continue in our faith journey, in our little bit of faith. And if we have that little bit of faith, then we can say to the mountain, get up and go into the sea, which is sort of the next passage that happens after transfiguration in the middle there. And it's that faith and those experiences within the context of the Orthodox Church that continues to make the truth self-evident. Because I wouldn't be alive, literally, without God's intervention. My marriage would not literally be in this place it is now. My kids would not be where they are now. I would not be able to survive in my job as a First Nation social worker without what I am able to become in the church.
And you've mentioned some advice that you'd have for people that are interested in Orthodoxy that might be exploring it to some extent. Would you have anything else that you would want to add to someone in that situation? Or even if you could go back in time and speak to yourself when you were exploring Orthodoxy?
If I was to go back in myself, I would say everything you thought you knew and understood by reading, you didn't know anything. There's a reason why baptism is called Holy Illumination, because it truly is seeing with new eyes. And for those investigating the Orthodox Church and the faith, I would say maybe don't use that word. Say you want to experience experience it. And so put down your books, turn off your podcasts, except for this one, of course. Turn off all the voices on the internet, regardless of good or bad. Just turn them all off and go to liturgy. And give yourself 6 months of going. And just sit there. And go to the meal afterwards. And get to know people. And experience the church. I was once told by a wonderful monastic that if you want to know and understand the church fathers, you first have to live like them. If you want to know and understand Christianity, you have to live like a Christian. And Orthodoxy is the place where you are given the freedom to live like a Christian, which means you're free to be sick. You're free to be wounded. You're free to be broken. You don't have to have it all together. In fact, you're not expected to. If you're coming from a tradition where, you were, involved and doing stuff and up at the front, don't worry. You can come to the Orthodox Church. Nobody's going to ask you to do anything. You just sit in the back. Nobody's going to be like, hey, do you want to sing in the choir? Or, hey, do you want to do that? No, nobody's going to do that. You don't got to worry about it. Take your time. It's about perseverance. And we need to give ourselves time. If you're coming in to experience the church, it's not going to happen overnight. Give yourself time. Give yourself space to grow into that. Ask questions. And not just of the priest, but of the people you see going. How did you come here? What's your experience? And read your Bible. Stop reading the church fathers, put them away, stop reading theological books, and read your Bible. When people ask me, well, what book should I, if I want to know about the Orthodox Church, what book should I read? There's only one that you should read, and it's called Holy Scripture. Go and read that book, and read it all the time, and go to liturgy. It's really quite easy.
Yes. Simple, but difficult. Simple to understand, difficult to practice thoroughly.
The faith is participatory. If you're not going to participate, if you're not going to put yourself out there in all that you are, like it's not. There's a wonderful story by about Saint Jerome having completed the translation of the Vulgate, right, from into the Latin Bible. He's out at during Nativity fasting in the desert, and he has a vision of Christ, and he offers Christ, his great magnum opus, his great work that he's done for the church, and Christ is like, yeah, no, it's all right, I don't need that. And then Saint Jerome's like, well, I will go into the desert and I will become an ascetic. And the Lord's like, yeah, I got enough of those. And finally, in his aspiration, Saint Jerome goes, what do you want? And Christ's response is, I want your sin. And that is, it's profound, because so often in an evangelical concept, a Protestant concept, we're sort of instructed to bring that God wants our best, right? We got to get our best, we got to perform. But in the Orthodox Church and in the true faith, all we're asked to give is the worst of us. All we're asked to do is say, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy upon me, the sinner. That's it. That's all that's required, which means it's open for everybody.
Well, that is a wonderful place to conclude the interview for today. So I want to thank you for your time, Father
Yes.
Symeon. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
As you, Max, and I was blessed to be in school with you, and I appreciate you, and God bless you and your family. And thank you so much for providing me this opportunity, and my blessings go to everyone.
Everyone, thanks for checking out that episode of the Orthodox Christian Podcast. If you have a question about Orthodox Christianity, there is a link to a form in the video description. Also, if you have not yet subscribed or liked a video, please do so. It really helps out on getting the videos out to a broader audience. And on the same note, if you know someone that would benefit from watching this video, please pass it along to them. In the meantime, have a great week. Take care.